Hey, welcome to Real Creepy Vids. My name is Steven. Tonight we have 3 scary true stories about the ghostly appearances of Eastern Airlines Flight 401's dead crew, the haunted aircraft parts from the Everglades crash site in Florida, and the mysterious chain of events that led Eastern Airlines to abandon their own official stance on these supernatural encounters. Let's get started. Story 1. The doomed Flight 401. On December 29, 1972, at approximately 8:30 p.m., passengers at JFK International Airport in Queens, New York, heard the boarding announcement for Eastern Airlines Flight 401 to Miami. The terminal was bustling with holiday travelers, many returning home after Christmas celebrations or heading to Florida to ring in the new year. Little did these 176 passengers know they were about to board a flight that would become one of the most notorious in aviation history, not just for the tragedy that was about to unfold, but for the unexplainable phenomena that would follow for years to come. This wasn't just any aircraft, it was the technologically advanced Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, an enormous passenger jet capable of seating up to 400 people. The L-1011 was Eastern Airlines' crown jewel, a state-of-the-art wide-body jet that had just been introduced to their fleet in 1972. Unlike standard jets with 4 seats per row, the L-1011 featured 8 seats per row across 2 levels. The main level housed the passenger cabin, while a lower level, accessible by 2 tiny elevators at the rear that could barely fit 1 person at a time, contained a full-size kitchen with ovens and refrigerators, plus a lounge area where flight staff could rest during long flights. Captain Bob Loft, a strikingly handsome 55-year-old veteran pilot with over 30,000 hours of flying experience, commanded the flight that evening. That's a staggering amount of time in the air, equivalent to spending more than 3 continuous years flying. Imagine that. Known throughout Eastern Airlines as a perfectionist who remained cool under pressure, Captain Bob was respected by crew and passengers alike. He took his customary seat in the front left of the cockpit, settling in for what should have been a routine flight to Miami. His first officer, Bert Stockstill, who was about 10 years younger than Captain Bob, sat in the co-pilot seat to Bob's right. The flight engineer position was filled by 51-year-old Don Repo, a man described by colleagues as a big strong ox of a person who was surprisingly soft-spoken and approachable. Despite his imposing physical presence, Don was known for his gentle demeanor and willingness to help other crew members. Don took his position behind Bert, the 4th seat in the cockpit, which was unusual for most commercial aircraft of the time, but standard in the massive L-1011, was occupied by Angelo Donadao, a 47-year-old Eastern Airlines employee. Angelo wasn't part of the flight crew but needed to get to Miami that night, so the company had placed him in the spare cockpit seat, a decision that would ultimately save his life. By 9:10 p.m., all pre-flight checks were meticulously completed. The skies were clear that December night, but moonless, creating a pitch-black backdrop for the journey ahead. At precisely 9:20 p.m., Captain Bob pushed the throttles forward, and the enormous L-1011 began to accelerate down the runway. The powerful engines roared as the aircraft gained speed, eventually lifting the massive jet into the night sky over New York, banking south toward their Florida destination. For the next 2 hours, the flight proceeded with remarkable normalcy. In fact, it was running so smoothly that one passenger, a man named Jerry Esco, actually took out stationery and began writing a complimentary letter to Eastern Airlines about the exceptional quality of their service and the smoothness of the flight. He planned to mail it once they landed in Miami. Talk about irony. This passenger writing about how great everything was just minutes before disaster would strike. It's almost like he jinxed the flight. At precisely 11:32 p.m., and I want to emphasize the exact time because it becomes important later, as Captain Bob began his approach to Miami International Airport and lowered the landing gear, a problem emerged. The L-1011 had 3 sets of landing gear, 1 under each wing and 1 in the nose of the aircraft. Each set had a corresponding green indicator light on the cockpit control panel that would illuminate when that piece of landing gear was properly deployed and locked into position. On this night, when Captain Bob activated the landing gear system, only 2 green lights came on. The nose gear indicator, The one that should have confirmed the front wheels were down and locked, failed to light up. It was such a small thing, a tiny light bulb probably worth less than $1, that would ultimately lead to the deaths of 99 people. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The cockpit crew immediately assumed it was just a faulty indicator bulb rather than an actual problem with the nose gear mechanism itself. This assumption made perfect sense. The aircraft was brand new, had been thoroughly checked before departure, and the likelihood of a mechanical failure in the landing gear was extremely slim. Modern aircraft are designed with multiple redundancies and safety systems after all. Captain Bob, following standard procedure for troubleshooting such an issue, first tried cycling the landing gear, retracting it completely back into the plane and then redeploying it, hoping this would resolve whatever electrical connection might be causing the indicator light to malfunction. The massive gear assemblies whirred and clunked as they moved back into the aircraft, and then extended again. But when they were once more fully deployed, the nose gear indicator still refused to illuminate. Growing increasingly frustrated but maintaining his professional composure, Captain Bob picked up his radio handset and contacted Miami Air Traffic Control. He explained their situation calmly. They had a possible landing gear issue and couldn't confirm with absolute certainty that the nose gear was properly deployed. Until they resolved this problem, he told controllers, they couldn't risk landing the aircraft. The air traffic controller acknowledged the situation and, following standard protocol for aircraft with technical difficulties, directed Flight 401 to pull away from the busy arrival corridor and circle over the nearby Everglades, a vast, desolate wetlands area that stretches across southern Florida. This would keep them safely away from other air traffic while they diagnosed and fixed the problem. Once over the dark expanse of the Everglades, Captain Bob and First Officer Bert methodically prepared the aircraft for troubleshooting. They set the autopilot to maintain a constant altitude of 2,000 feet and a steady speed of 200 miles per hour. The idea was simple. Let the sophisticated autopilot system handle the flying while they focused on diagnosing what they still believed was merely a faulty indicator light. With the L-1011 now cruising in a circular holding pattern over the wetlands, the crew turned their full attention to the problematic indicator light. What happened next would be a textbook example of how a series of small distractions can cascade into disaster. First, they tried pressing on the light, thinking perhaps it was just stuck or had a loose connection. When that didn't work, they began twisting it, hoping to improve the electrical contact. Captain Bob, growing more determined, eventually decided to remove the bulb entirely from the panel to inspect it. He carefully pulled it out and examined it in the dim cockpit light. The filament appeared intact, so he blew on it to remove any potential dust or debris, then attempted to reinsert it into the socket. But in the confined space of the cockpit, working with small components while wearing his uniform, something went wrong. The bulb went in at an angle, becoming wedged sideways in its socket. Now they had an even bigger problem. Not only was the indicator light still not working, but it was physically stuck in the panel, impossible to remove or properly seat. I mean, we've all had moments where something simple goes wrong, and then our attempts to fix it just make everything worse, right? But usually the stakes aren't quite this high. Increasingly frustrated and aware that 176 people were waiting to land after an already long flight, Captain Bob turned around in his seat to address Don Repo, the flight engineer sitting behind the co-pilot. With the indicator light now completely unusable, they needed to verify the landing gear status another way. Don, Captain Bob said, I need you to go down into the hellhole and check the nose gear directly. The hellhole, a term pilots used for this cramped, uncomfortable space, was a small compartment located directly below the cockpit floor, accessible through a trap door in the center of the cockpit. Once inside this claustrophobic space, a crew member could look through a small window on the aircraft's underside that provided a direct view of the nose landing gear assembly. It wasn't a pleasant task in the best of circumstances, requiring the engineer to squeeze through the tight access hatch and contort themselves in the confined space. Don Repo, ever reliable, immediately got up from his seat. He moved to the center of the cockpit, knelt down, and opened the trap door that led to the hellhole. The black rectangular opening looked ominous in the dimly lit cockpit. Don lowered himself through the opening, and disappeared from view as he descended into the cramped space below. It was at this critical moment, and this has been thoroughly investigated and confirmed by aviation experts, that Captain Bob, while turning back around in his seat after instructing Don, inadvertently nudged the control yoke, the steering wheel of the aircraft, with his knee or leg. This seemingly inconsequential contact was enough to disengage the autopilot system without triggering any obvious warnings. With the autopilot now silently disconnected, the L-1011 began an almost imperceptible descent from its assigned altitude of 2,000 feet. The massive aircraft started sinking toward the Everglades below at a rate so gradual that none of the 4 men in the cockpit noticed what was happening. This critical error went unnoticed for several crucial reasons that would later be exhaustively analyzed by air crash investigators. First, the night was pitch black outside, with no moon and no ground lights visible over the vast uninhabited Everglades. This meant the pilots had absolutely no visual reference points to notice their decreasing altitude. They couldn't see they were getting closer to the ground because they couldn't see the ground at all. Looking out the cockpit windows would have revealed nothing but an impenetrable void of darkness. Second, the descent they had inadvertently initiated was so gradual, reportedly only about 200 feet per minute, that it didn't create any physical sensation of falling or sinking. The passengers and crew would have felt no different than they did during normal level flight. There would have been no lurching or dropping sensations, just the steady vibration of the engines and the gentle white noise of air passing over the fuselage. Third, and perhaps most significantly, all 4 men in the cockpit had become completely fixated on the landing gear indicator problem. This phenomenon, known in aviation psychology as task fixation, is one of the deadliest traps pilots can fall into. Their entire cognitive attention was focused on a minor issue involving a light bulb worth less than $1, while their $50 million aircraft with 176 souls on board was quietly, gradually descending toward disaster. The L-1011 did have altitude warning systems designed to alert the crew when they strayed from their assigned altitude, and in fact, at some point during this descent, an altitude alert did sound in the cockpit, but investigators believe it only triggered once, wasn't particularly loud, and in the context of 4 men actively troubleshooting another problem, the warning was either not heard or not mentally processed by any of the cockpit occupants. I mean, imagine being so focused on a little light bulb that you don't realize your massive passenger jet is slowly sinking toward the ground. That's exactly what happened here. Terrifying to think about. It's like texting while driving, but at 200 miles per hour, with 176 lives in your hands. A momentary distraction, and everything changes forever. As the aircraft continued its silent, steady descent toward the dark expanse below, the passengers remained completely unaware of the danger. Some were likely sleeping, others chatting, reading, or perhaps anxiously waiting to land after the unexplained delay. None had any idea that in just minutes their lives would be forever altered, or for 99 of them ended altogether. Meanwhile, 2,000 feet below in the Everglades, 43-year-old Robert Marcus and a friend were out in an airboat looking for frogs. The only light in the vast darkness came from Robert's headlamp. As they stood on their boat surrounded by the sounds of alligators and other wildlife, Robert spotted an orange and yellow flash about 5 miles away that quickly dissipated. Curious, they headed toward the location. After about 15 minutes of cruising at 40 miles per hour across the dark wetlands, they arrived at a scene of unimaginable horror. Flight 401 had crashed into the Everglades at over 200 miles per hour. Because the plane had descended at a gradual angle and hit the relatively soft, muddy ground, the impact wasn't as devastating as it might have been on harder terrain. This, combined with the swampy ground immediately extinguishing the fire from the explosion, resulted in dozens of survivors among the 176 people on board. When Robert and his friend arrived, they were the first on the scene. Though they could hear screams and cries, they couldn't see much until Robert raised his headlamp. The beam revealed body parts scattered across the ground and survivors with horrific injuries. One man, his clothes burned away except for bits of socks around his ankles, was still strapped to his aircraft seat, which had fallen forward into the mud. His face and upper body were pinned underwater, and he looked up at Robert, pleading for help before he drowned. Robert and his friend pulled the seat up, saving the man's life, but there were far too many people needing immediate assistance. About 30 minutes after Robert and his friend had arrived at the crash site, the sound of helicopter rotors cut through the night as Coast Guard rescue teams reached the scene. The chaos that followed was both heroic and heartbreaking. Coast Guard personnel, along with Robert and his friend, waded through the swamp, climbing over twisted metal and navigating treacherous debris to reach survivors. The rescue effort was made more difficult by the terrain. The Everglades is not solid ground but a river of grass with water that can range from a few inches to several feet deep, filled with alligators, snakes and other wildlife. The darkness complicated things further, with only flashlights and searchlights from helicopters illuminating the massive debris field. All through the night, they worked tirelessly, pulling survivors from the wreckage, stabilizing those with serious injuries, and evacuating them to hospitals in Miami. The cries of the injured, mixed with the sounds of rescue equipment and the constant drone of helicopter blades overhead, created a nightmarish soundtrack. Some survivors were found still strapped to their seats. Others were discovered floating in the shallow water, clinging to pieces of the aircraft. By the time dawn broke over the Everglades, painting the sky in pinks and oranges that contrasted cruelly with the devastating scene below, the rescuers had to accept a grim reality. There were no more survivors to be found. Only bodies remained to be recovered. The final toll was devastating: 99 people dead, including Captain Bob Loft, First Officer Bert Stockstill, and Flight Engineer Don Repo, who had gone down into the hellhole to check the landing gear. Among the 77 survivors was Angelo Donadao, the fourth man in the cockpit, who had just been catching a ride to Miami, and Jerry Escow, the passenger who had been writing that complimentary letter about the quality of the flight shortly before the crash. The recovery operation continued for days, as teams worked to retrieve bodies and collect evidence from the crash site. The wreckage of the L-1011 was scattered across a swath of the Everglades, much of it submerged in the murky water. Personal effects, books, clothing, toys, jewelry, were found mixed with the twisted metal of what had been just hours earlier, an advanced passenger aircraft carrying people home to their families. Robert Marquis, the airboat operator who was first on the scene, would later be recognized for his heroism. His quick actions that night saved numerous lives, though he would reportedly be haunted by the memories of those he couldn't save, the faces and voices of the injured, who didn't survive long enough for proper medical care to arrive. The National Transportation Safety Board launched what would become one of their most thorough investigations to date. Over the following months, they meticulously reconstructed the events leading to the crash, analyzing cockpit voice recordings, flight data, wreckage patterns, and survivor testimonies. Their final report confirmed what many had suspected: human error was the primary cause of the crash. The report specifically cited the flight crew's preoccupation with a minor mechanical problem, the landing gear indicator light, and their failure to monitor the flight instruments properly during a critical phase of flight. The report also noted that while an altitude warning had sounded, it was not sufficiently noticed or acted upon by the cockpit crew. Eastern Airlines, facing both legal and moral obligations, made extensive efforts to compensate both the survivors of the crash and the families of those who perished. Settlements ranged into the millions of dollars, though no amount of money could ever truly compensate for the losses suffered. The airline also implemented sweeping changes to their pilot training programs, with new emphasis on cockpit resource management, teaching pilots and crew members to better distribute their attention during problems, to maintain awareness of critical flight parameters at all times, and to ensure that at least one crew member is always monitoring the aircraft's basic flight status, especially altitude and airspeed, even during emergency situations. The aviation industry as a whole learned valuable lessons from Flight 401. Modern cockpit procedures now emphasize the sterile cockpit concept, where during critical phases of flight, all conversation must be directly related to flying the aircraft. Many airlines implemented the two-person rule, ensuring that if one pilot needs to focus on a specific issue, another is explicitly assigned to fly the aircraft. But this tragedy was far from over. The crash of Eastern Airlines Flight
401 had left its physical mark on the Everglades and its emotional scars on survivors, rescuers, and the families of victims. But something far more inexplicable was about to begin, something that would challenge the understanding of even the most rational observers and leave hundreds of airline employees questioning the boundary between life and death. What followed would become one of the most widely witnessed and documented series of supernatural occurrences in modern history.
Story 2. The Phantom Crew. For almost 3 years following the crash, an extraordinary phenomenon began to unfold throughout Eastern Airlines' fleet. A phenomenon so disturbing and widespread that it would eventually involve hundreds of employees, from flight attendants to pilots to maintenance personnel. What makes this case particularly compelling is the sheer number of witnesses. These weren't isolated incidents reported by individuals with questionable credibility or histories of making supernatural claims. These were experienced airline professionals, pilots with thousands of hours of flight time, senior flight attendants who had served for decades, mechanics who understood every inch of their aircraft, suddenly reporting encounters that defied rational explanation. Even more remarkably, many of these encounters were witnessed simultaneously by multiple people, sometimes including passengers with no connection to the airline or prior knowledge of Flight 401's history. In one case, as we'll discuss shortly, an apparition was reportedly seen by 8 people at once before vanishing in front of all of them. Eastern Airlines' official response to these reports was swift and harsh. The company desperately tried to suppress the stories, concerned about both their public image and the potential impact on passenger bookings. When employees reported these experiences to supervisors or through official channels, they were typically either referred to psychiatrists, implying they were suffering from mental health issues, or simply fired on various pretexts. Despite this intense pressure and the very real threat to their livelihoods, some brave employees felt compelled to come forward with their stories. Many did so anonymously, speaking to journalists or researchers investigating the phenomena while carefully concealing their identities to protect their jobs. The airline's attempts to silence these reports had the paradoxical effect of lending them more credibility. After all, if these were merely the delusions of stressed employees or elaborate hoaxes, why would Eastern Airlines go to such extraordinary lengths to cover them up? Why would they ultimately take the costly step of replacing perfectly functional parts salvaged from Flight 401 if there was truly nothing unusual occurring? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me share some of the most well-documented encounters, and you can judge for yourself what might explain them. In March 1973, just 3 months after the crash, the first documented encounter occurred. 2 flight attendants, whom I'll call Ginny and Denise, their real names have been protected, were assigned to Eastern Airlines flight number 318, another L-1011 TriStar jet in the company's fleet. What makes this particular aircraft significant is that plane number 318 contains several parts salvaged from the crashed Flight 401. This practice, while it might sound macabre to lay people, was actually standard in the aviation industry. After the investigation, many undamaged components from the wreckage had been meticulously examined, rigorously tested, certified safe, and subsequently installed in other L-1011 jets in the Eastern Airlines fleet. This wasn't done out of disrespect or cost-cutting. These were extremely expensive, precision-engineered components that were confirmed to be in perfect working order and had played no role in causing the crash. In the highly regulated world of aviation maintenance, these parts received even more scrutiny than normal before being certified for reuse. From the airline's perspective, this was simply making efficient use of valuable resources that happened to have an unfortunate history. Neither Ginny nor Denise had been aboard Flight 401 when it crashed. Neither had any personal connection to the deceased crew members. Neither had any history of paranormal claims or interest in supernatural phenomena. These were experienced, practical, level-headed professionals just doing their jobs. And yet, what they experienced that night would challenge everything they thought they knew about reality. During the flight, Ginny and Denise were busy serving the nearly 200 passengers on board. Some attendants worked on the main level taking orders, while others were down on the lower level preparing food and drinks. At one point, Denise, who had finished taking orders upstairs, decided to go down to the kitchen to help Ginny. Coincidentally, Ginny had just finished prepping her cart and decided to go upstairs to find Denise. They passed each other in the elevators without knowing it. After asking around upstairs and learning that Denise had gone down to look for her, Ginny returned to the lower level. The kitchen was empty, but the moment she stepped off the elevator, Ginny had a powerful sense that someone was there with her. Expecting to find Denise, she started preparing food, while occasionally glancing at the closed door leading to the lounge area. After several minutes with no sign of anyone, Ginny became paranoid, wondering if Denise was hiding and planning to scare her. The feeling of another presence grew stronger, until Ginny couldn't focus on her work. She walked to the lounge door, pushed it open, and looked inside. Finding no one there, the sensation intensified, sending chills throughout her body. Ginny searched behind all the chairs and sofas, but found nothing. Now she had to make her way back to the elevator, through what she knew was an empty kitchen and lounge, yet still felt haunted by an unseen presence. She pressed her back against the wall and inched toward the kitchen, expecting to see someone appear at any moment. When she finally reached the elevator, she had the terrifying feeling that someone was right behind her. When the doors opened on the main level, Ginny nearly knocked over another flight attendant named Mildred. Seeing Ginny's pale, sweating face, Mildred led her to the back of the plane, where they found Denise looking equally shaken. It turned out that Denise had experienced almost the identical sensation when she had been alone on the lower level just minutes before. God, can you imagine being trapped in that situation? I don't think I could handle it. 1 month later, the same plane, number 318, was at Newark Liberty International Airport preparing for a flight to Miami. After passengers had boarded, the senior flight attendant, Sis, began counting passengers and discovered they had one too many. Looking down the first-class aisle, she noticed an Eastern Airlines captain seated among the passengers. Assuming he was deadheading, the practice of airline employees hitching rides on company flights to reach destinations where they were needed, Sis approached him to get his name. Standing directly in front of him, she introduced herself and asked if he was deadheading. The captain stared straight ahead, seemingly unaware of her presence. After several attempts to engage him, another flight attendant named Diane came over. When the captain continued to ignore them, Sis went to inform the flight's actual captain, George. George came out of the cockpit and approached the silent captain, kneeling down to get a good look at his face. Upon seeing the man's face, George fell over and exclaimed, "Oh my God, that's Bob Loft, the same Captain Bob who had died on Flight 401. Before anyone could react further, the seated figure vanished into thin air right in front of George, Sis, Diane, and 6 nearby passengers. The passengers became hysterical, screaming and crying. The crew, though shaken, organized a thorough search of the plane, causing a significant delay. No trace of the mysterious captain was found. Upon landing in Miami, George, Diane, and Sis immediately filed detailed reports about the incident through the airline's official channels. They documented everything meticulously: the appearance of the mysterious captain, his failure to respond to multiple attempts at communication, George's immediate recognition of him as the deceased Captain Bob Loft, and most importantly, his sudden vanishing in full view of multiple witnesses. The existence of these reports was confirmed by several other Eastern Airlines employees who saw them in the following days. However, something strange happened next. Just a few weeks later, when word of the incident had spread through the company grapevine and other curious employees asked to review the reports, the logbook containing them had mysteriously disappeared from its standard storage location. When these employees inquired with management about accessing the reports, they were told, incredibly, that George, Diane, and Sis had never filed any such reports at all. The company position was suddenly that no such incident had ever been documented or reported through official channels. However, over the next 2 years, numerous unexplainable events occurred on L-1011 jets containing parts from Flight 401. What made these incidents particularly credible was their consistency. They primarily centered around sightings of the same 2 deceased crew members, Captain Bob Loft and flight engineer Don Repo, and they occurred exclusively on aircraft containing salvaged parts from the crashed plane. According to documented reports gathered by investigators, these include a senior Eastern Airlines vice president, a man with decades of aviation experience and a reputation for level-headed skepticism.
boarded one of the L-1011s for a routine inspection. In the first-class cabin, he noticed a captain in full Eastern Airlines uniform sitting alone. Approaching to greet the officer, the executive recognized Captain Loft, whom he had known personally for years. Before he could process what he was seeing, Loft vanished before his eyes. The executive was so shaken that he immediately deplaned and ordered a thorough search of the aircraft. Like previous searches, it yielded nothing. The executive, who had been known for dismissing earlier reports of apparitions, never publicly acknowledged what he'd seen, but multiple sources confirmed he privately admitted to the encounter and became notably less dismissive of other employees' reports afterward. In another incident, a catering staff member was stocking supplies in the galley on the lower level of an L-1011 when he noticed a man in an Eastern Airlines flight engineer's uniform standing at the far end of the kitchen area. When the caterer greeted him, the man turned slowly toward him, revealing the face of Don Repo. The caterer, who had seen photographs of the crash victims in news reports, recognized Repo immediately. Within seconds, the figure disappeared before his eyes. The catering employee ran from the plane and flatly refused to reboard. His entire team similarly refused to enter the aircraft, causing a significant delay while another catering crew was arranged. The airline officially attributed this to a staff dispute, but internal documents later revealed the true nature of the incident. Oh man, imagine being alone in that lower galley and turning around to see someone who shouldn't be there, someone who died months ago, just staring at you. I get chills just thinking about it. One of the most unsettling incidents involved a captain who reported hearing strange bang and thumping noises coming from the hellhole during a flight. This same space where Don Repo had been sent on the doomed Flight 401 now seemed to be the source of inexplicable sounds. Following protocol, the captain opened the trap door and descended into the cramped compartment to investigate. Finding nothing unusual in the space, he turned to climb back up into the cockpit. As he looked up through the trap door opening, he saw a man standing in the cockpit, looking down at him. It was Don Repo. The captain reported that Repo's face was clearly visible, illuminated by the cockpit instruments, and that their eyes met momentarily before Repo simply vanished. The captain, a veteran with over 15,000 hours of flight time and no history of psychological issues or belief in the paranormal, was so disturbed by the encounter that he requested immediate reassignment to a different aircraft type. His request was granted with unusual speed, and he was specifically instructed by management not to discuss the incident with other crew members or the media. Then there was the widely reported incident involving a female passenger in the coach section of an L-1011 flight to Phoenix. According to multiple witness accounts, this woman had been quietly reading a magazine for most of the flight when she suddenly began screaming hysterically, pointing to the empty seat beside her. Flight attendants rushed to her assistance, where the visibly terrified woman insisted that a man in an airline uniform had suddenly appeared in the seat next to her. She emphasized repeatedly that he had not walked up the aisle or moved into the seat, he had simply materialized beside her. When she turned to look at him directly, she claimed he had vanished right before her eyes. The woman's terror was so genuine and extreme that she had to be physically restrained upon landing in Phoenix and was ultimately removed from the aircraft in a straitjacket. Psychiatric evaluation at a Phoenix hospital found no history of mental illness or hallucinations, and toxicology screening showed no evidence of substance use that might explain the episode. What's particularly notable is that this passenger had no knowledge of Flight 401 or the previous apparition sightings. She was simply an ordinary traveler who experienced something so terrifying and inexplicable that it caused a severe panic response. While most of these encounters were frightening to those who experienced them, there was at least one documented instance where these apparitions appeared to be helpful. This case is particularly intriguing because it suggests purpose or intent behind the appearances rather than just random manifestations. A captain preparing for departure from Miami International Airport reported entering the cockpit of his L-1011 for pre-flight checks when he observed flight engineer Don Repo standing by the engineer's panel. Before the stunned captain could speak, Repo turned to him and delivered a clear warning. "There's a problem with the number 2 engine, don't take this plane out." Then, just as in the other encounters, he vanished. The captain, though shaken, immediately ordered an unscheduled inspection of the specified engine. Maintenance crews discovered a serious issue that would likely have caused an in-flight failure had the aircraft departed. The problem was in a location that wouldn't have been checked in routine pre-flight inspections and might have gone undetected until catastrophic failure occurred. When questioned about how he knew to check that specific engine component, the captain initially told the truth, that the deceased flight engineer had appeared and warned him. After being ridiculed and threatened with psychiatric evaluation, he quickly changed his story to claim he had just had a hunch. However, several maintenance personnel who were present during the initial disclosure confirmed his original account. The warning was so specific and the discovered issue so potentially dangerous that it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. This incident raised disturbing questions. If these appearances were somehow real rather than mass hallucination or hoax, what was their purpose? Were the deceased crew members somehow trying to prevent another tragedy? Another notable element of these sightings was their seeming connection to specific aircraft parts. Through careful documentation of reported incidents, a pattern emerged showing that apparitions were only reported on L-1011 aircraft that contained salvaged components from the crashed Flight 401. No such sightings occurred on Eastern's other aircraft, including other L-1011s that didn't contain these parts. This correlation became so apparent that employees began referring to certain aircraft as haunted, and some crew members would check maintenance logs before flights to see if they were assigned to planes containing the salvaged components. Some reportedly called in sick or traded assignments to avoid these specific aircraft. In 1974, these mysterious occurrences came to an abrupt end. The timing coincided with a very specific and unusual action taken by Eastern Airlines. Despite continuing to publicly deny the validity of these supernatural reports and officially dismissing them as either hoaxes or the product of overwrought imaginations, Eastern Airlines quietly implemented a sweeping policy change that seemed to contradict their stated position. Without any official announcement or explanation, the airline issued internal directives to remove every single part that had been salvaged from the crashed Flight 401 from their entire L-1011 fleet. Maintenance crews were instructed to identify, remove, and replace these components, all of which were still in perfect working order and had passed rigorous safety inspections, with new parts at considerable expense to the company. This decision made little sense from a financial or operational perspective. These salvaged parts were extremely expensive, thoroughly tested and certified to be in perfect working condition. Replacing them prematurely represented a significant unnecessary cost for the airline. So why would Eastern Airlines incur this expense if they truly believed there was nothing unusual happening with these specific aircraft? Even more telling was the secretive nature of the operation. The parts removal was conducted with minimal documentation and no public acknowledgement. Maintenance crews reported being instructed not to discuss the replacements or their unusual nature. When pressed for an explanation by confused technical staff, management reportedly provided only vague references to standardization of components or precautionary measures without specific details. John Fuller, an investigative journalist who documented many of these events in his book The Ghost of Flight 401, attempted to obtain official confirmation from Eastern Airlines about the systematic removal of these parts. The airline consistently denied that any special removal program had taken place, despite multiple maintenance workers confirming that they had personally participated in these operations. What is beyond dispute, however, is the result after the salvaged parts from Flight 401 were removed from Eastern's L-1011 fleet. The apparition sightings stopped completely. Not a single credible report of encounters with the deceased crew members emerged after this point. This correlation between the removal of parts from a crashed aircraft and the cessation of ghostly sightings related to that crash remains one of the most compelling aspects of this case. If these encounters were merely the product of imagination, hysteria, or hoax, why would they stop precisely when the physical components from Flight 401 were removed? To this day, the events surrounding Eastern Airlines Flight 401 and its aftermath stand as one of the most widely witnessed and documented cases of allegedly supernatural phenomena in modern history. Over 200 separate employees and passengers reported encounters, many of which were independently corroborated by multiple witnesses. The airline's apparent behind-the-scenes actions, removing the parts while publicly denying the phenomena, only adds to the mystery.